others as you'd have them do unto you. Hello, everybody. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Ten Commandments in particular and how it influenced the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. We're going to talk about now the Ten Commandments, starting with the first three. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not worship any graven image, and thou shalt not take God's name in vain. What many people assume is that this is a monotheistic statement, when here we see that there are other gods besides this one God that the Israelis followed. Thou shalt have no other God before me. And also there were different kinds of gods. Some were made of graven images, while this particular God spoke directly to the people, and they heard him from the heavens. So, like in any polytheistic society, there's many different kinds of gods, and not only many gods. Also, in the third commandment, we see thou shalt not take God's name in vain. It's not a reference to profane language, and it's a reference to the idea that God's name, meaning the God that Jehovah that took them from their captors and saved them from their enslavement, that they should not forget this God, because this God was the one indeed that liberated them. So this moral code of the Ten Commandments then would be attributed to this God, who was to be recognized through his name, not through any form of graven image. Now let's look at the next three commandments, starting with number 4. Remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, honor thy father and thy mother, and thou shalt not kill. Now these are three elements that relate to the first three, that this particular God is also the creator God. That's what remember the Sabbath, keep it holy is referring to the seasons and how this God is to be commemorated. And so a lot of misconceptions exist about the creator God, because they assume that this God creates something out of nothing, or created the universe out of nothing, but that is not at all what the name Elohim refers to. It's that this God formed the universe. He created the seasons and the cycles of days, and so in this way, this God was to be remembered because of its nurturing care that was provided for them on a daily and regular basis. And so this is the connection here that these people have with this God. Is like a father or mother, as you see, in the honor of thy father and thy mother. And also this God also fought valiantly for them. When he says, thou shalt not kill, they did not raise an army and fight the Egyptians, but this God, in fact, fought on their behalf, and on their behalf liberated them from their captors and enslavement. And let me add one more thing before I move on, is that this God that also creates apparently kills, but this is not how men were to kill under this God, but to receive the aid and the help from this God, because when Moses killed, he definitely violated the commandments, but he was not punished. He was corrected, you might say. It's only until Moses killed by throwing the Ten Commandments at the worshippers of Baal, who had erected a graven image in God's name. Only then Moses took it on himself to commit this act, and so this cannot be attributed to God. And so God did not punish people according to their violations of these commandments, but these commandments originally were a moral document in order to provide the proper correction. Now let's look at the next three commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not bear false witness. Now these three are referring to the standards, how these commandments are to be kept and how they are to be preserved. Originally, they were a moral mandate that was given to the Israelis directly from God as they heard God's voice from the heavens, without a lot of stipulation attached to it. But then after the people said they didn't want to be led in this manner, but they wanted a human authority like Moses to speak directly to them. At that point, the standards changed. We see that now when you killed or when you violate the commandments, you're worthy of death. And this was how Moses interpreted them. So we start to see that Moses was, in fact, the first judge who interpreted these moral laws, these moral commandments, and in so doing, made them into moral laws. And so we see a progression here of how these commandments were used and how they were understood and applied. And so the original commandment here was related to this God that would lead them and protect them, and also to the Creator who would provide for them and what they needed, so stealing was not necessary, and that they could serve each other as this God was serving them. So adultery was not necessary, given that God had formed man and woman of the earth and given them the freedom to be able to join and to form their own laws and communities. Now let's look at these latter commandments in particular. Thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not bear false witness. Now these relate specifically to conduct and what is proper conduct, which is how you are to acknowledge this God's service. And so, as this God gave form to matter, did God also give man the creative ability to help himself? Now let's talk about the latter. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Here is also that these commandments in some form relate to the idea of God, that they are a witness to God's goodness and helpfulness, and consequently that's just how they should relate to each other. In the same way, thou shalt not steal means as God provides for them, there's no need for them to steal or to deny the needs of others or helping others. Now let's look at the last commandment, thou shalt not covet. This is a summation of all the 10 commandments, which is a reference really to human nature, that there are certain things in human beings that distinguish them from this God who led them and who showed goodness to them in their time of need. And so this God does not have any need because it doesn't depend on the servitude of others. It has earthly needs, unlike the graven images that often had to be sacrificed to, in order for the pagan gods to provide a service. And sometimes gods were formed of graven images like the Egyptians worshipped, and Pharaoh and these pagan gods, you might say. Even though they had powers, and we see that the Pharaoh's magicians had powers, these gods seemed to have powers, but they were not comparable to this God who gave form to the earth and all that's in it. So what this means really is it's a first declaration of universal law and universal moral code or word of God, one that didn't acknowledge other moral codes as equal, but men as equals. And through this moral code is how people could define equality and find equality with one another.